Hey, it's Sloth here. I'm so glad you came by. I'll get the kettle brewing while we get caught up. For today's video, we're going to be redesigning some of the G1 Monster High boys. I was originally debating doing the mandatory G3 redesigns that all art YouTubers must do, and I still might if that's something you guys would want, but when I was looking back at all G1 designs, I was harshly reminded how, unfortunate, shall we say, a lot of the boys' designs were. Now I do get why Monster High is a girls' fashion doll line, and all doll lines struggle with selling their boy dolls in general, so it makes sense they didn't have as much effort put into them since almost none of them were likely planned to become actual dolls. And Monster High is really about our fabulous ghouls anyway, so the boys also just don't have much screen time for their designs to matter too much, especially when the main event, the ghouls' outfits, are always killing it. You can really tell that Deuce was the only one they expected to sell, and him be like the token boy doll that parents buy so their kids can play house, since he's the only one of the boys following the design rules set up by the girls. Usually in my fandom videos I do a little illustrated premise section to explain the spark notes of the media I'm talking about, so you guys can always follow along even if you've never heard of the media. But for this one, the premise is so short that it doesn't seem like there's a point, and if you're on this side of art YouTube, I'm going to assume you know the general gist of what Monster High is. If not, it's a show about a group of high school girls going to school and their teen drama, but everyone in the show and the girls themselves are all based off of various gothic and folkloric monsters. The show was made to sell fashion dolls whose main selling point to set them apart was that they dressed in alternative styles. With that explanation out of the way, let's get into our designs. We're going to be starting out with Claude, as alongside Deuce he's really one of the main guy characters. But before we get too far into it, I want to talk about my goals and parameters with these designs. I didn't want these to just feel like I was putting them in modern fashion, but instead making them more match the vibes the girls' designs have, so I wanted them to feel kinda 2010s. I also mentioned in our intro about the rules of the girls' designs, which is kinda what I want to lean into and follow with these. So, for my observations, these are the factors that make Monster High designs feel, well, Monster High. 1. A strong sense of personal style in each character. I've always found it a bit weird that almost none of the boys are part of any kind of fashion subculture. 2. A signature colour palette made up of 2 to 3 colours, with often strong black or white accents. Most of these colour palettes are analogous or triadic. 3. Lots of patterns. The girls all have at least one signature pattern, but most are wearing multiple, and the pattern work is often a large part of their design. These patterns often allude to the monster/story they're based on. 4. Accessories. The girls always wear a huge amount of them. And lastly, 5. Bright colours. Well, yes, alternative in fashion, most of the girls wear saturated colours. In general, I find it a little odd that so few of the boys seem to be part of any subculture when it's such a prominent selling point for the girls, so it was something I wanted to change in these designs. That being said, I didn't make Claude alt. I just can't imagine him as anything but a himbo jock. In his canon design, Claude, alongside the majority of the boys, wears a varsity jacket for the school's basketball team, which really contributes to their designs feeling so samey. While uniforms are not uncommon in character designs and can be a great way of visual storytelling, it's important to make sure characters style those uniforms differently to showcase their personality more and just to help them visually stand out from each other. But most of the team are just wearing it over a t-shirt and jeans, so they're really 2 steps away from all wearing the exact same thing. Claude is the only member of the basketball team I'm designing in this video, but if I was to do the others, I'd try to really style those jackets quite differently on each. Since Claude is the captain, and I think sporty jock is a fitting style for him, I let him keep his jeans and jacket look. Though I did swap out his shirt for a hoodie with crescent moon patterns peeking out underneath his now done up jacket. I made his jacket cropped as well so that it would sit in a more rectangular way and suit his body type better. In the show, Claude does actually receive his own prominent patterns, which are these crossed bones on his button-up shirt. They show up in his other outfits too. I decided to change these mostly for fun, but I made one of his earrings be crossed bones as a homage to his canon design. Instead, I made his patterns be paw prints in the lunar phase. His outfit came out more 80s than I was intending for it to be, but you know what, that's fine, because the OG Teen Wolf movie came out in the 80s, so we're just going to pretend that it was an intentional reference. I drew all of our boys in the same pose as their official art, but for Claude's I used a pose from, I think, the Scarus line instead, because his main outfit, his arms are crossed, and I'd literally just finished doing Jackson, who also has his arms crossed, so I wanted them to have different poses. I tweaked it so that he was doing a 2-finger salute though, since in the original pose he's holding the brim of a hat. I gave him a typical basketball body type, muscular but long and tall. Since Claude is strong and reliable, I made his main shape be rectangles, with some softer edges since he really is a sweetie. I ended up changing all their faces too, which may be controversial, but there are some things I wanted to get across that the OG faces wouldn't express. Also, it is just fun. I'll explain my reasoning on the other 2 designs when we get to them, but for Claude it was for 2 main reasons. Number 1, I wanted to include my rectangles in his facial features, and number 2, I think a lot of the werewolf boys in the show just look way too old. Claude probably looks the most his age, but oh my god, look at those cheekbones and mutton chops. I know they're so hairy because they're werewolves, but mixed with the very strong bone structure they have going on, it just serves to make them look often inappropriately older than the teen girl protagonists. Romulus is definitely the worst offender of this, like, look at this guy, what do you mean he's in high school? So I wanted to make Claude look more plausibly like a teenager. I softened his bone structure up a lot and gave him some cheeks still shedding the last bits of baby fat. I also changed his mutton chops to some sideburns and bushy brows connecting to his hairline instead. I wanted to make sure that he was still hairy since he's a werewolf, but giving a character actual facial hair will almost always make them look like a full-grown man, since most teen boys can't grow much beyond some bum fluff. I changed his eye shape too to be some soft rectangular eyes, making them pretty large for some true puppy dog eye potential. I really wanted him to have his sweet himbo energy obvious without taking away from his coolness. Big adorable doe eyes just felt fitting for him. I wasn't entirely sure what style to put his hair in, debating making it a natural fro or locks before deciding to style it as twists. Claude already has his own colour palette of pink, yellow and blue, so I kept with that and just played up how prominent the colours were for some more interest. Also because I think it's really cute that his main colour is pink to match Draculaura. I changed the design of his varsity jacket so that his sleeves were yellow instead of it being uniformly black all over. Character design tip for you, it's a good idea to have sections that overlap a lot, like hands and arms and torsos, to be different colours or values, so that poses are easy to read even at a quick glance. I thought having different coloured sleeves would also be a good way to customise each boy's jacket further too. The way the show customises the jackets is by having each boy have some kind of pattern on the sleeves. Claude has some claw marks on his, which I kept in my design, but I added some extra details too. I put a paw print on his upper arm, the lunar cycle on one side of his chest, and an M for Monster High on the other. I gave him a belt chain with the lunar cycle and some straight cut jeans with paw prints going up one leg. I wanted to keep a lot of the elements of his original design, but just tweak them to be more interesting, especially since the other designs in this video are so different from their canon counterpart. I think a lot of people struggle designing mask presenting characters, since men generally dress in less interesting fashion, but honestly all that really means is you have to emphasise interesting or strong shape language to compensate. Men aren't boring to design, men's fashion is just talked about less. If you have mask OCs you're struggling with, I so highly suggest following men's fashion influences and researching subcultures, movements and tailoring. Men's fashion has a lot going for it and it can be really interesting and unique, it's just that men aren't taught to value and experiment with their fashion, so you just hear about it less than women's fashion. Also, you don't have to put a character in a realistic outfit that the average person would wear if you don't want to. There's plenty of interesting movements in men's fashion and subcultures which you can also play into if you wish. I changed Claude's truly hideous boots for some Cat Noir inspired trainers instead, the grooves at the front there to imitate paw prints. I originally forgot to add his paw print to the sole of the boot, but you'll see later in the speed point I added it at the end. I also added some freckles last minute because he just really looked like he'd suit them. I gave him a sweatband to make him look appropriately sporty and some socks with crescent moon patterns. And with that, we're done with Claude.
Whoa, slow your growls, sis. Sure, she's a cool ghoul, but I've known Draculaura since I was a pup. We're just going as friends, promise.
I like the way that this design came out. I think he looks like he could be a cool golden retriever himbo. He probably gave me the most trouble designing, since I wanted him to wear the most conventional fashion and keep his varsity jacket being prominently worn. I kind of wish I'd made his pink his primary colour instead of yellow though. I just think it's really sweet that he wears the Draculaurus colour. Anyway, let me know what you think and let's get into our next design. Next up we're going to be redesigning Holt Hyde, and here's where our designs are going to get really unrecognisable from the original, because Holt has what I think is single-handedly the worst Monster High design. Absolutely none of it matches. He looks like if a less committed Two-Face and Ghost Rider had a child together, and that child had no fashion sense. Why does he have a face tattoo? Why are his shoes and nothing else green? Why does he only have a thumb ring and no other rings at all? What is happening? Listen, I don't envy the character designer for Holt. Hyde is a really hard character to adapt to a modern day teen boy who's supposed to be cool enough for tween girls to fawn over and fit into your monster themed setting. Because Mr. Hyde is just an ugly middle-aged man, like fundamentally, visually he's just some man, some ugly ratty human man who murders people. Which isn't really giving teen heartthrob or cool monster. I was debating taking away the fact that he's a fire elemental before I rewatched the show, because it just felt like an odd element to me that distracted away from his actual deal. And I won't lie, when I was a kid I used to always confuse him and Heath, so biased there. But upon rewatching the show it's mentioned that he's Heath's cousin, and that's fun lore, which I'd completely forgotten about since watching it as a kid. And it is important to him and Jackson's characters that one looks like a monster and the other like a normie, so I retract my confusion and we're keeping him being a fire elemental. Also, someone pointed out that it's probably supposed to be a pun on him being hot-tempered, and you know what, that is such a Monster High pun, we need to keep it. Though if this was a rewrite video, I would make Holt actually have a temper for that pun to work better, since he's not that angry of a guy in the show, and it'd help make him and Heath feel more different. Personally, I feel like they're often stepping on each other's toes, both in design and in personality, so I'd want to set them apart more. He's based off of Edward Hyde, he shouldn't be too chill of a guy. I wanted to play more into the descriptions of Hyde from the novel and de-emphasise the fire motifs in his design, since one, that's Heath's deal, and two, it just doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to be too prominent for him. I think these pinstripes on his trousers were supposed to be a nod towards the novel, since they were popular in Victorian fashion, but that's the only hint we get towards Hyde, really. Like, if we're being honest, would any of you really be able to guess at all what character he's supposed to be referencing? Neither Jekyll or Hyde is described in too specific of detail, but what Stevenson keeps bringing up constantly is that Hyde is short, like really very notably short, and extremely rat-like in appearance. He's also younger than Jekyll. We also keep getting told there's a wrongness and loathsomeness about Hyde, even though no one can quite describe what. We get told he gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation a lot too. Now, Holt isn't a villain in a gothic horror novel, he's a romantic interest in a show about fashion dolls for tween girls. So I didn't want to make him actually displeasing to the eye, as he's described to be, especially since the monsters in Monster High are always the slave versions of their original descriptions, and it'd go against his purpose in the story to be too ugly. So I cherry-picked his description a bit. Hyde being shorter than Jekyll, who is mentioned to be tall, is really important in the novel, because it's the visual metaphor for Jekyll's good side being larger than his evil, even despite everything, so it adds a level of tragedy to the story. And you know, as a vertically challenged guy myself, I love some short king rap, so we're going to be making Holt hella short. The girls have a big sister and little sister body type difference based on height. So, in a universe where they expected the boys to sell equally well, I'd imagine they'd do the same for the guys, so in this hypothetical universe, our Holt would have the little brother body type. I also kept his rat-like features as well, with him having a large nose tip, bushy brows, buck teeth. His ears are hidden under his headphones, but they are also large. I made them pointy too, since Heath also has pointy ears. I gave him a really thin and lanky body type too, with a pronounced Adam's apple, because I thought it'd contribute to his rattiness, and Hyde is described as sickly and lithe. I imagine this Holt appearing younger than Jackson, like their book counterparts, so if Jackson's 16, Holt is more like 15. don't ask me how that works with him being born like this, I don't know. The other hints towards his novel counterpart are in his patterns and accessories. I replaced his pinstripes and flames with potion beakers and the chemical formula for salt. The potions because Jekyll uses a potion to manage to shift to each identity, and the salt because the reason Jekyll could no longer change back to himself was because in creating the original potion he'd used a specific salt. Each time he tried to recreate the potion with the same salt, it failed until he concluded that the original salt must have contained some unknown impurity which caused it to work. The novel never actually tells us what salt he was using, so I just used the chemical formula for table salt. Also, the formula looks a bit like a circuit board, which I really like because it plays well into him being a DJ. The other reference to the novel is quite a dark one, which is the inclusion of the cane. So the original novel is actually from an outside perspective and not Jekyll and Hyde's, since the original twist was that the two were one and the same. Instead, we follow Jekyll's lawyer as he looks into the increasingly strange behaviour of his friend and finds connections to ongoing crimes. One of the first big clues connecting Jekyll in this string of crimes is that Jekyll is a very well-dressed man, and has a unique custom cane made for him. The lawyer had actually gifted this cane to Jekyll himself. Later, smashed up pieces of this cane are found on a murder scene where a man had been beaten to death. Okay, yes, I know that is an extremely dark reference, but Jekyll and Hyde doesn't have much iconography like a lot of gothic horror does, so we need to take what we can get. And the target audience for Monster High would probably be too young to understand the reference anyway, so I think it's fine. Monster High are the ones who made a character based on a book where the title characters are murderers, and Frankie is literally made out of corpses, so is it really any worse? Now, fashion canes aren't really a thing anymore, and definitely aren't the kind of thing a teen DJ would wear, so I made his and Jackson's be for mobility purposes instead. One of my friends joked that they need it because constantly changing heights damages their spine, and you know what? That's as good an explanation as any. I bedazzled his cane to fit into the rest of his design by splitting the colours half and half and giving it decorative spikes. Also, fun fact about the novel for you, the author Robert Louis Stevenson is also the guy who wrote Treasure Island, which I think about all the time. What a wild duo of books to have under your belt. One of the things that really confuses me about Holt's canon design is that even though he's a DJ, I couldn't tell you what music genre he looks like he'd be into, which is strange, right, because music is the lifeblood of most subcultures. He's just vaguely rebellious looking in the most Disney Channel way. So, our version of Holt is going to be really into EDM. It was popular in the 2010s, it's a big part of raves and DJing, and it has a ton of LEDs in the fashion, which feel like they'd play into the glowing fire element of his design in a really fun way. And it gives us a really strong sense of fashion to work off, since it inspired its own fashion subculture. I made his primary shape to be a triangle since he's rebellious and a wall breaker. His canon design doesn't have a strong colour palette defining it, so I just chose a new one for him, which is pink, purple and blue. I wanted to move away from the reds just so that he and really entirely looks different than Heath. And of course I had to make him neon for the true EDM fashion. I chose purple as his main colour because Jackson's main colour is yellow and purple is the opposite end of the colour wheel. I changed his hair into a more subtle fire, seeing as he's only half fire elemental, and once again to move him away from Heath. I made it short and spiky since that was a popular style in the 2010s. It didn't look quite obviously enough like fire though, so I did add some sparks coming off of it at the end. I used the fire to make him look like he had frosted tips, which I thought was also fun since it makes his hair half and half coloured. His pupils are yellow to hint towards Jackson. I actually really like that both Jackson and Holt have eyebrow piercings. I think it's a cool nod to them being the same-ish person, and I'm just happy that any of the boys are wearing any accessory. I kept them both having the piercing, but I did change it up a little. Instead of a simple ring, I gave Holt piercings that imitate devil horns. I also gave him some nose piercings and some on his ears too, since it feels odd for someone to have an eyebrow piercing but not lobe ones. I gave Holt some prominent canines for those triangle shapes, and because I really like the fact that he looks a little demonic. Holt is wearing fingerless gloves and trouser braces, which he also has in common with my Jackson design you'll see in a bit. He and Jackson have the same nose too, since they are technically brothers. I wanted them to share some physical traits despite how completely opposite each other they are. I noticed a lot of the Monster High boys have very rectangular eyes, and decided to try to keep that in my designs, since it feels like it's part of the style, even if I'm drawing it in my own style. I think Holt having softer almond eyes is also a really interesting element of his original design, since it subverts what you might expect. It's usually the parts of a character design that subvert the rules set up by the rest that make a design feel more memorable and nuanced rather than a walking archetype. So I really wanted to keep his eye shape while adapting it into my own style. For his actual outfit, which of course is the main focal point for any good fashion doll, I went with lots of puffy shapes. I wanted him to look relaxed and cool, but with a strong silhouette to give him a strong stage presence. He's a DJ, he should feel like he takes up a room in a party and isn't easily lost in crowd scenes. His jacket is cropped and absolutely humongous, and like all of his outfit he has a half and half split on the colours. I like to imagine that he wears such large clothing to make himself seem taller. I feel like he'd be really salty about Jackson being taller than him. I've never met a sibling duo who don't care about who's the tallest. Under his jacket is a pretty simple tank top with his salt pattern on, and then he's wearing some puffy joggers and trainers. All of his clothing and accessories have blue LED strips on the lining, so that he's really truly impossible to lose in any party. For his accessories, he has his signature headphones, which I made square instead of circular. I just wanted them to look more unique, and I didn't want him to be wearing any circular shapes where I could help it. I changed the skull on his headphones to a beaker too. I gave him tinted visor sunglasses, which are very popular in EDM and rave fashion. My headcanon is that Holt also needs glasses, but refuses to wear obvious ones because he doesn't want to look like a nerd like Jackson. He has some nail polish on too, black on one hand and the indigo blue on the other. And with that, we're done with our Holt.
Look, I don't know what comes over me. I mean, sometimes I just feel like there's another person inside of me just, trying to get out. Huh. Stupid, huh?
He definitely has my favourite of these designs. I feel like I accomplished everything that I wanted to in his redesign, and I think it suits his personality too. Admittedly, I still don't think that you'd be able to guess what gothic character he was based on, but I think there's enough hints in there you could go, oh, I guess that makes sense, after being told. I can live with him not being too clearly Hyde, because that's a hard character to make instantly recognisable without sticking a top hat on. I feel like if I was a little kid I would have wanted a doll of him, so main goal achieved for me. Now, let's get into our last design of the video. You'll already know our final design is Jackson, our Jekyll kid. Now, I have much less beef with Jackson's design than I do Holt's, but it does have the problem that most of the guys do, that being every single scene they share with the girls feeling like that Elton John carpool meme. I decided to make our Jackson nerdy emo, so ties with t-shirts and fingerless gloves are a must. It felt like the natural progression from Canon Jackson's long bangs and outcast nervousness. Jackson already had his own colour palette in the show, so I took that and adapted a little bit, making it yellow, orange and blue instead of yellow, green and blue. I just personally don't like this blue-green combo in the original. As a kid, Jackson was my favourite of the guys by far, but looking back I think that might have just been because he was the easiest to interpret as trans. Oh, to be a neg again, projecting hard onto random male characters with no understanding of why. I haven't watched all of G3 yet, but I have heard that Jackson and Holt aren't in it, which I do understand. I mean, if you take Jekyll and Hyde and remove the potion/mad science element, and Hyde being evil, you are basically just creating a character with a real-life mental illness that people can just have. I think you can make that work in your favour. The zombies in Monster High are clearly coded as disabled, and I think honestly pretty good representation, especially of non-verbal folks, so I think you could just embrace Jackson and Holt as a DID allegory. I mean, like, even in G1, most of the problems they had are things I imagine real DID systems have to deal with them realising that the other exists after struggling with periods of blacking out, and then having to learn to communicate with the other. I'm not a system though, and I also get why they might feel like they play into the evil alter ego trope, seeing as they are literally based off of Jekyll and Hyde, even if Holt himself isn't actually evil. I know G3 changed a lot of the characters who have problematic elements in G1, so I'm just assuming this is why these two were left out. Anyway, back to the design. I wanted Jackson to feel as totally opposite to Holt as possible, so his main shape is circles, which also felt fitting since Jackson is a pretty soft and harmless guy. And, of course, I had to embrace Jekyll's physical description for our inspiration. The following is how he's described. A large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50, with something of a slyish cast perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness. Now, obviously we're disregarding the middle-aged element, since Jackson is in high school, but working with everything else there. As I mentioned in our Holt section, this version of Jackson is going to be very tall, and I decided to make him fat for our circle shapes. While this isn't what the original text is implying by calling him large and well-made, I also just don't think it contradicts it either. I wanted him to be much broader than Holt too. I did contradict the smooth face description depending on how you interpret that line in our new high schooler context. Later on I gave Jackson some acne because teens should look like teens. I always find it really weird how hard teen media villainizes and makes a big deal out of spots, when I've never met anyone who didn't have at least some as a teenager. They're just a thing kids have, it's just not that deep. I made Jackson's eyes soft and downturned, and gave him some chubby cheeks to make him feel kind and give that aura of goodness Jekyll is described as having. I let Jackson keep his eyebrow ring and just gave him more ring piercings for his circle shapes and emo aesthetic. He also has angel fang piercings because Jackson really wants to be a monster and feels very outcast for looking like a normie, so I feel like it makes sense for him to get something to look more like a monster. Jackson has pink pupils to match Holt's main colour. I altered Jackson's blonde highlight too, I just don't fully understand his frosted tips on a longer cut hair look. So now just his fringe is blonde to play a little bit into that half and half thing that Holt has going on. Though I did make that a lot more subtle on Jackson, seeing as it's a twist in the show that he and Holt are the same guy. Only his leg warmers are split two different colours. I made his hair much longer so it styled into that emo shag which was really popular in the 2010s. I changed his hair from dark brown to black just because I felt like it. Alright, I want to sidebar a second and talk about Jekyll and Hyde a little bit. I promise this will become relevant. Jekyll and Hyde has some very undeniable queer themes. The red herring of the book is that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde may be engaged in a homosexual relationship, and Mr. Hyde uses it to blackmail the good-natured Jekyll. This is talked about in the book's introduction, as written by A. Robert Mighall. While this suspicion is never explicitly voiced, likely it would not have been allowed to have been at the time, it is certainly written in a way to imply such a reading, since Stevenson could not be punished if a reader came to their own conclusions. Jekyll gives Hyde a full run of his house and tells the servants to treat Hyde as they would him. He has his own special door to the house, and Jekyll's checks to the man are always honoured. Jekyll also bought Hyde his own house in Soho, which is the gay capital of London and was also at the time too. The residence is noted as being decorated in a fashion more to Jekyll's tastes than Hyde's. Jekyll confesses to taking a very great interest in Mr. Hyde. All this while none of Jekyll's oldest friends have ever met the man, which leads to Mr. Utterson, the protagonist of the book, speculating that Jekyll is being blackmailed by Mr. Hyde. On top of this, Jekyll is also an unmarried man, despite being from a wealthy and well-respected family and being in his 50s. I also don't think it is unreasonable to suggest the possibility that Jekyll is queer and Hyde, being a manifestation of all of his repressed desires and without guilt, engaged in homosexuality, which was illegal under sodomy laws at the time. Chapter 10 is a letter/statement written by Jekyll, detailing his life and experiment, and is where a majority of this reading comes from. Jekyll writes about his life before the experiment. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached the years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. Many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. Then, further down, though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame, than when I laboured in the eye of day, at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. This is how he describes turning into Hyde for the first time. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new and, from its novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body, Within I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. He goes on to theorize that Hyde was so small and sickly as a result of Jekyll having repressed the desires of which Hyde was made for so long. And then speaking of what he did, as Hyde says, "The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde they soon began to take a turn towards the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my own vicarious depravity." I do think it's interesting to note that Jekyll finds what undignified things he did as Hyde too shameful to recount while describing in some detail the first murder he committed. There aren't many things that might be more shameful than murder, but homosexuality in 1886 is one of the few things it might have been. When the potion began to first falter, Jekyll describes having to decide between which of the two identities to permanently inhabit. Between these two, I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with a greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde. But Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, or but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest, Hyde more than a son's indifference. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die those appetites, which I had long secretly indulged, and had of late began to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become, at a blow and forever, despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales, for while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not even be conscious of all that he had lost. As Robert Mickhall details in his essay Diagnosing Jekyll, the scientific context to Dr. Jekyll's experiment and Mr. Hyde's embodiment, which is included in the Penguin's classic publication of the book, earlier drafts of the book were more explicitly sexual. In the earliest surviving draft, Jekyll confesses, "From a very early age, however, I became in secret the slave of disgraceful pleasures." This was revised to, "From an early age, however, I became in secret the slave of certain appetites," in the printer's copy, before once again being revised. I bring this up, one, because I love the undeniable queerness in the vast majority of Gothic horrors, and I think it's a hugely important part of interpreting the themes of repression in the novel, and two, for this reason, I would make Jackson and Holt queer. And I'm not going to miss an opportunity to talk about how prominent queerness has always been in history and art. Listen, I love non-binary Frankie, wonderful, beautiful, transcendent, and I'm just saying, Frankie is already Jackson and Holt's love interest, so they wouldn't have to touch on the internalized homophobia element of the text if they didn't want to, but they also totally could if they did want to. If it's handled correctly, I think that's a perfectly fine thing to be put in children's media, because unfortunately a lot of queer kids do have internalized homophobia, and it can be helpful to see a character with similar struggles to you. I also bring this up because those themes of repression, judgment, and societal expectations are why I chose to make Jackson's secondary pattern eyes, as a representation of the watchful eyes of a society that forces you to repress yourself. His other pattern, like Holt, is beakers for a nod towards the potion. His shirt is hidden by both his arms and his tie, but this is the print underneath. It's a band shirt for a fictional emo band called the Uttersons. Mr. Utterson being the lawyer of Henry Jekyll and the protagonist of the book. I thought the quill would be a fun nod to him being a lawyer. Also hidden in this pose, he has black nail polish and a leather bracelet with spikes. I absolutely covered his cane in so many stickers to personalise it more. I believe it's mentioned that Jackson's favourite subject is mad science, and I thought looking sciencey would make him read more plausibly as Jekyll, so I give him some goggles which he keeps on his head. I really like that Jackson's canon design has a half untucked shirt to show that he's disorganised, so I kept it and made him a little messier. One of his sleeves is rolled up while the other isn't, and one of his leg ornaments has fallen down. I think it's also a subtle half and halfness about his design too, without being too obvious. He's got an emo little belt chain and black shorts. One side has a brace and the other has eyes painted on it. And of course, what would an emo be without platform boots? And with that, we're done with our last design.
Well, I did go. I remember being outside trying to get my courage up, and then... nothing. I must have been so nervous I blacked out. All that loud music, and there's just so many people. Plus you make me nervous.
I won't lie, something about the eye pattern and gold makes him really read like a human Bill Cipher, and I have no idea what to do about that. I think this is the design I'm most like, yeah, it's good, but it's not quite there yet for this video. I don't dislike it, but it feels like it's missing something. I think he could have done with some more accessories like necklaces and chunky bracelets and maybe even some shoelace beads. It doesn't quite feel over the top enough for what I was going for, and I think more jewellery could have fixed that potentially. But I got to talk about queerness in historical work, so I'm happy. Here are all three of our boys in the lineup. As always, let me know what you think and which design was your favourite. I am debating maybe on doing a part 2 to this. I'm thinking I'll redesign Heath since he was such a large part of my decisions with Holt. Maybe I'll do Gil? I'm not sure though, because oof, that's rough, buddy. I'm not sure how to unugly him. I tend to do 3 designs in a video, so comment which of the G1 boys you'd want to see get redesigned. I will say I think Deuce is at the bottom of my list to redesign, simply because I think his design already looks fine next to the girls, but if enough of you guys would want to see me do him, I'll include him anyway. Also, comment if there's any video topics you want to see in the future in general. I'm thinking of doing an art tips video next, and then maybe something Dimension 20 related, but there should be a poll up soon in my community tab about upcoming topics, so stay tuned. Anyway, if you liked this video and want to see more stuff like it, but don't want to rely on the homepage suggesting my stuff again, maybe subscribe and check out my other videos. It's been nice having you all around. I hope you drop by again.